thoughts on processes for peace, and this is the agenda. Peace negotiations, that will be actually the bulk of our discussion today on peace negotiations. And then we will end with designing a peace process for Southern Thailand. And basically the reason why I have chose Southern Thailand, because it is still an ongoing process. And then it is still not successful. It's still ongoing. There are still a lot of challenges that we are having to overcome in this process. And the information about this conflict, I think, is well known. So this is something that basically everybody know of, and it is something also that can be useful for us to discuss. Basically, when we talk about the approach that we have to a conflict situation, most of the time, we have been talking about the situations where groups are involved, intergroup type of conflict, conflicts between this group and that group, between the government and an insurgent movement, or between two ethnic or identity groups. We have been mostly talking in that particular context. We have not really talked so much in terms of personal, the personal context. But each of us, when we work in a conflict situation, yes, we belong to a group, but we also have our own, personal preferences when it comes to how we deal with a conflict situation. In fact, a lot of things that what we have, personally will be carried, when we engage in addressing or handling conflict situations when we are in a group situation. And personally, many of us, it depends on a number of things. It depends on the issues, it depends on the context, it depends on a lot of things, but it also depends on what we feel is important for us. What is the objective, what kind of goals that we are trying to achieve. How much is it important for us? So, that's where we have this one, concern for self. How much is it important for us? And for us, usually, personally, it is not only one goal, but then, it can be a number of goals, so, but we can put them into like a gradient. How much is it important? And then if we have more than one issues, what are the importance of each particular issue? So the first thing is to look whether it is concern for self, concern for us, or is the relationship more important? Is the relationship between us and the other group is more important, and we try as much to accommodate what we how to accommodate so that we can maintain relationship. The psychologists would say it depends whether we are concerned for self or we are concerned for others, to the extent that either we do one of these things. So just quickly, contending will be, if we feel that the goal is so important for us that we have to fight for it. We are not concerned for relationship, but we are concerned for our own interests, our own goals. The opposite of that is yielding. Yielding is that when we yield to the other group, because we feel that this is something that we need to preserve the relationship, and like I said earlier, different contexts would determine different style. For example, if you are in a situation where it is a conflict that involves somebody on the other side who we value our relationship. So for example, if I am in a conflict with my wife, for example, I'm yielding all the time, because that is more important, or family members or somebody close to you. So we always accommodate, we always accommodate, as opposed to something that we feel it is important. We are in a situation at work, for example, and then we are concerned about our promotion and all those things, and then we try to do as much as possible to get for ourselves. Problem solving is when win-win for everyone. But then if we cannot get win-win, maybe we can sort of get a compromise that will make at least for us to be happy, at least 50%, or more or less 50%. Withdrawal means that we don't care for ourselves and we don't care for relationship. It doesn't matter what happens. We don't care, so much. We have these things. It will result in if you do it properly, it will result in either a problem solver, compromiser, accommodator, controller, avoider kind of approach. When we do assessment on this, we look at not only what is the highest score, but when the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth score. Why is this useful? It is also useful. It's also useful when when we want to assign people to do negotiation. So that's the next step of discussion. The next topic for discussion is on negotiation. And negotiation is something that we do all the time. And a person who always tries to avoid a topic, or who always tries to accommodate the interest, will probably not be a good negotiator for our side, because we want somebody who always wants to to achieve a situation where we can solve the problem in a win-win situation, or to get a compromise solution, or even if necessary to control the situation so that it can be to our benefit. So we would always look out for avoider and accommodator, and this would not be good candidates to be a negotiator. Negotiator has to be someone with an interest to solve the problem and to get what we also feel would be important for us. Another two articles to read. One is To Be a Negotiator, Strategies and Tactics by Lieutenant General Lazaro Sumbewo. And the other one is Letters to a Young Mediator, which is a compilation of letters written by some of us who have been involved in mediation situation before, and our advice to young people who wants to become mediators. I just want to show that in basically in terms of teaching peace, these are the kind of topics that we sometimes teach. We talk about conflict mapping and analysis and all those things. We talk about the approaches that we have when we are in a conflict situation. But for this particular session today, we'll be talking about negotiation and mediation, meaning that sometimes it is also important for us to present to our students the importance of being in a process, not necessarily saying that they will become negotiator or they will become facilitator or mediator, but at least for them to get an understanding of what the process looks like, and what is when we say that this is a situation that we have to resolve, we have to do a peace process, what does it mean? And then for them to understand the details of these things would also be very useful. So that's why we also teach negotiation, we teach mediation. Okay, and these are just examples of some of the readings that we use. And the content of some of this would be something like this. And this is from that book. This is from that book by General Sumbewo. He described his own experience about doing negotiations in the context of Africa, where he has a background of he has a military background, but then when he retired, he was also asked to negotiate. And he he gave a very good description of how it is like to be in a negotiation process and what are some of the things that is useful. General Sumbewa said that basically, we have to do preparation as the first stage. And it's also interesting to note that a lot of this, when we do mediation, the steps, are basically the same. And always the step will start with preparation. Preparation, doing preparation, knowing who you are and your ethics and all those things before you start the negotiation. You agree on the agenda and then the strategies. And these are his own from his own personal experience. He would say something like, focus on the objective. Know what you want and what the other side wants. And this is interesting, because this will put us in the position that if we want to compromise, what can we expect, from our compromise? We need to have our lowest common denominator. We need to know our batna. What is batna? Batna is what is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If we do not negotiate, what can we expect from the situation? What is the worst? So know what we want, what the other side want. When we do the conflict mapping, remember that when the conflict mapping look at the needs, the wants, the position, the interest. We need to be able to do a conflict map that not only reflects one side but both sides. So if I'm going to a negotiation, I know already what my position is, I know what I want, I know what I need. Then I have to do a reflection, to think about how is it from the other side? What is it that they want? What is it that they need? Okay, so you need to do all those things. Then ask direct and clear questions. Use the language that people can clearly understand. Do not confuse, the other side. Do not give up anything for nothing. Be realistic and rational. Have some fallback position. What are our other options that we have? Be on top of the situation. We write, and record our documents all the time. Then we need to agree on how to implement. How to implement a particular agreement. Okay, and negotiate with people who have authority, because otherwise the person, those negotiators will not be able to implement whatever it is that we agree upon. Reality check, to check on the situation, from time to time, with the context on the ground. And all those things. Then these are some of the tactics. Use temper sparingly. Do not accept no for an answer or give no for an answer. Be firmly flexible. Take away and walk out. Sometimes we negotiate and we cannot get what we want, and we feel that the other side is bullying us into accepting their position. It is okay. It is okay if we say, no, I don't want to be part of this. This is something that is not useful for me. Then walk out, okay, and start all over again. Okay, so we have this. So these are just some of the negotiations content in a situation. To be a negotiator, strategy and tactics, you can read the details there. It's easy to read, written by a military people, so it's not filled with jargons and academic things that we always like to write. So it's very straightforward, so it's easy to read. And then of course, if you are interested in more detailed reading, you can read other literature, other books. I think when you do something like that, it is to show respect to the other side. So it is useful. It's not really important, but it is something which is useful, because you want to be able to create some kind of connection between yourself and the others. Not necessarily trust, because trust, that one comes over time, but that initial contact, that initial contact will show to the other group that, look, I know your culture, I respect your culture, and that is a good beginning. That is a good beginning. So yes, that is something that can be useful. But if we have a situation where two groups, let's say a government and a rebel movement doing negotiation, it depends. It doesn't really matter so much. It doesn't really matter so much. But that kind of appearance would be useful if one person is going to the ground to meet up with various communities to negotiate on something. Then that can be useful, as a starting point, in the communication and toward creating trust. So yes, I would say that's useful. In terms of appearance, people like to wear their national costume, to reflect their identity. Okay, this is who we are. And then just by looking at us, this is our costume, this is a reflection of our culture. So that can be useful as well. This is all part of the process of confidence building. Even if we are not mediators, facilitators, or negotiators, as researchers of peace and conflict studies or human rights, we have to engage with various communities, to get information, for example, for our research, or to get information to prepare ourselves for the next step of doing negotiation. And these things are very important. Trust building is important. You need to be able to do that. I had the same experience also many years ago, more than 20 years ago, when I was doing work in Mindanao, and I went to the march area, Ligawasan March, looking for information with the MILF, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and they would not allow us to go to the camp. We had to stay, on the outskirts of the Ligawasan March, waiting for them to bring us in. And so, it was also like a test to see who we really are. And we went through also that same experience while waiting. While waiting there, we heard the call of azan for prayers, and they say, okay, let's do our asar prayer. And they said, okay, why don't we get our Malaysian friend to be the imam for today? And of course, no problem. As Muslims, we all can be imam, no problem. So I was the imam, they were all at the back. And if anybody had taken a photo at that time, they would think I'm, especially looking like this, they would think I'm like the head of the, MILF, but to me, that is also part of the test to see, my credentials, without looking at papers, so we gain a lot of trust. Another, a lot of other experience as well, to create that contact. People in conflict areas, they like to smoke and drink coffee a lot. So if you are a coffee drinker and you smoke, that is also an advantage, especially in Indonesia. I go to Aceh, I think I must have drank so much coffee and smoke so much cigarette, and a kretek cigarette, Samso and Godang Garam. I don't know how I managed to survive. Some friends also told me that when they go, they also look for signals. Signals can be things that will tell you whether you are acceptable or not, that people want to talk to you or not. So for example, some friends who went, and this was the earlier part, before the negotiations with the GAM, the Free Aceh movement. They will go into the for appointment with the GAM leaders, and then they would meet them, but then they will look at what kind of food is being served. If no food or no drinks is being served, then that means that you are not, you are not welcome. If they serve some drinks, then maybe We're gonna have a meeting. It's not gonna be a very long meeting, but if they prepare a meal for you, then there's gonna be a long discussion. So we need to be able to look for these signals, and it's difficult to explain and to describe, because each context would have different kinds of signals. Each culture would have different kind of signals. So that is the negotiation. And negotiation, I'm presenting negotiation here because we need to look at the steps in mediation, in negotiation, because the mediation process is usually a continuation of negotiation activities, but involving third parties. A third party situation will be something like this. This is just a simple, a diagram, the research agenda in the studies of conflict transformation and peace building process. And a lot of research actually can be done looking at third parties. Who are the actors, their impartiality or neutrality, the strategies used by the actors, doesn't matter who they are, tracks 1, 2, or 3, what are their roles, the multi-track approach, whether the approach is comprehensive or not, whether there are complementarity and contingency plans and all these things. So this can be suggestions for research in the conflict transformation, peace building, and peace process. But peace negotiations usually look like this. I'm trying to break down into more simple approach. So basically, we have direct negotiation between parties A and B. At the same time, we also have third-party intervention, and third-party intervention depends also on what the parties want, because the parties will decide what kind of role the third party will play. So the third party can play, for example, an arbitration role. An arbitration role is basically a legal framework, where you send your case to a particular arbitrator or judge, International Court of Justice or whatever, with the intention to have the issue settled. And the third party will go through the issues and all those things, and then will come up with a decision, and the decision have to be accepted by both parties. So you have that arbitration. Another third party intervention would be either mediation and facilitation, which is basically the involvement of a third party, with the agreement of both parties, to either mediate or facilitate a particular conflict situation. And the difference between mediation and facilitation is the level of power. The level of power and the level of influence the third party has on the conflict parties. Because facilitation is where you have a third party that comes in and facilitate the discussion without really forcing solution or decisions on the conflict parties. Okay, they facilitate, share the meeting, make sure that everything goes well, prepare the meeting room, prepare everything, and then share the meeting in a way that will allow the two sides to negotiate among themselves with the facilitation of the third party. As compared to a mediation, mediation usually has more influence of the third party on the decisions, on the decisions. Mediators can come in with solutions. Mediators can have more leverage on the other parties, on the conflict parties, pushing them this way or that way. Examples of facilitation would be like the situation where the Malaysian third party is involved in the situation in the Bangsamoro, Mindanao, the MILF. Malaysia is not mediator. Malaysia is the facilitator of the process. Okay, we guide the process. We facilitate the meeting, but solution has to come, from the two sides themselves. Okay, the same thing with the Aceh, where the mediation process was conducted by the CMI, Crisis Management Initiative, and the facilitator was the former president of of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, and he was somebody, that really, play his mediation role, very actively, to the extent that he would force the two parties to sit together and then to discuss everything. He would determine what kind of issues that need to be discussed and all those things. So, his role was a bit stronger, than the role that was played by the previous third party in the GAM Jakarta peace talks, which was the Henry Dunant Center or Humanitarian Dialogue Center from Switzerland. That was more of a facilitation role. The CMI role with Martti Ahtisaari was more of a mediation role. And Martti Ahtisaari would say something like, we will no decision, we will not agree on anything unless we agree on everything. He ties all the decisions together. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And the parties have no choice but to follow his instruction. Okay, so he has that kind of, that kind of persona. And of course, when we have a situation like this, we have all those people surrounding, surrounding the process. We have the supporters on both sides. We have advisory board that can come from within or come from outside. We can have joint expert groups, that come in and try to give, what their opinion might be on the process to help with the mediation facilitation process, or to join together with the advisory board to give advice to the parties. We have the formal process and also the informal process, and we have back channels and so on and so forth. So it's quite complicated process where a lot of actors are involved, and we have to be sure, we have to make sure that the process move along nicely without interference from skeptic opponents. There will always be people who will be skeptical of the process. They can become spoilers, for example. And who are these spoilers? Spoilers can be if there is another party C, for example, that feels neglected because party C is not invited to the process. So party C then become a spoiler. Or there can be spoiler coming in from groups that they feel that if we have a solution, but the solution is not conducive to our well-being or to our interest, then we want to spoil, the process. What's your take on this peace negotiation, this basic structure of peace negotiation? That's a very, very good question. Issue of representativeness. How, who actually represents the parties in a formal process. And I'm stressing the formal process because there can be also informal process. And informal process, can involve many groups, okay, and at different levels. But a formal process is one where it is a process that is seen by the parties as a process that can resolve that particular situation with formal representative from the parties. If there is a formal dialogue process or a formal peace process that has been initiated by the parties, then we need representative that formally represent the parties. Formally. If we are just talking, like normal dialogue, then it's a different thing. But if we are talking about a formal process, then that party must have their own, formal representatives that represent their side, and they have to be careful in choosing who are the panel members, who are the negotiators in a formal process, because that panel, those negotiators will represent the interests of the parties. Okay, the interests of the party. So for example, We have the Mindanao, Bangsa Moro, MILF peace process. We have the government, with a panel that has been appointed by the Philippine government. And that's the formal peace panel. Whatever is discussed outside, of that formal process, that's just supporting the formal process. We have a formal process, with the government having its own panel. The MILF, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, also has their own formal panel of negotiators that they have carefully selected and appointed to negotiate with the government. So you have both sides formally appointing representatives in a formal peace process. Are there also any other processes? Yes, there are other informal processes. We have meetings, informal dialogues, track 1.5, track 2, track 3. We have many other processes where the two sides have representatives or people of interest from the two sides that not only negotiate, but dialogue and conduct relationships and all those things on the side. But as far as a formal peace process is concerned, only the formal process is something that we need to focus on. The same thing in Southern Thailand. Southern Thailand, for many years, have had contacts between the two sides. But the Thai government never formally recognized those processes, even if they say that they sent government representatives, to dialogues, to meetings, with the various groups, but those processes are not formal process. Okay, so whomever is there then becomes, a representative, with their own personal capacity, with their own personal capacity. The same thing, many members of the liberation movement from Southern Thailand also meet up, with the Thai government, but in their own capacity, representing their own personal group. At the end of the day, all those processes, were not did not come to any decision, and nothing has been implemented until we started the program. The process in 2013, where the Thai government finally acknowledged that they want to have a dialogue with the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, one of the group representing the Southern Thailand Patani people, and then they send their panel, except that, the situation was such that the BRN was not really, representing the organization and not really representing the people. Okay, because the people said that, the person, Ustaz Hassan Taib, at that, dialogue, did not really represent our interest. So you have a situation of representativeness, issue of representativeness, even in a formal, even in a formal process, and that, resulted in that whole process, not really, being successful. And then they move on to other, to other processes. Then that question again of who actually, represents the Patani people. Is it the BRN? Is it the Mara Patani? Is it Pulo? Because there are various groups. Okay, there are various groups. Now we have a process in Southern Thailand that is formally recognized by the Thai government, with the BRN, Barisan Revolusi Nasional, with Malaysia as the facilitator, and it is the only recognized process that we have for Southern Thailand Patani at the moment. So all the other processes have been set aside. Okay, all the other processes have been set aside, and the people talking at that panel also have to prove that they represent the two sides. So issues of representativeness is always ongoing. It's always ongoing. You have to prove that when you sit at the panel, are you representing your group? When you sit at the panel, are you representing the people on the ground? The people on the ground. One of the major problems here in this process in Southern Thailand is that there are people on the ground in Patani, in the provinces of Yala, Patani, and Narathiwat, who says that, look, I don't want to be represented by the BRN. they do not represent me because I have different ideas. Then we have, that kind of problem, but still, the only formal process that we have is the one between the Thai government now and the BRN. So issues of representativeness is always very important. This is a very tricky issue. So in terms of Jakarta dialogue process, it has to depend on how both sides want to see this process. Is this just a normal dialogue session, or is this a formal process where the two parties agree to be involved in a talk and to send their representatives, in an attempt to find an outcome that can resolve the situation in Papua. Okay. And then if that is so, then the representative on the government side would have to be selected by the government, would have to include, okay, different members, including, from the government, agencies, from the security, from the home affairs, to include also members of the securities, the army, the police, those that represent the government side. Okay. In a formal way. On the other side, the Papuan panels, first of all, which organization are we talking about? Or are we talking about a combination of different organizations and individuals? Okay. And then are they truly representing also on the people on the ground? And then there must also be constant consultation done, between that particular panel with people on the ground. So we have to be careful, how we set up, this panel, because the credibility of the process and the credibility of the decision will depend on representativeness, issue as well. Even up to now in the Philippines, you have groups saying that, even if the MRF has signed an agreement, the Bangsamoro agreement with the comprehensive agreement for the Bangsamoro, there are still people that say, no, I reject that agreement. The MNLF, Nur Miswari, for many years said that, no, this is not an agreement that the MNLF wants to support more, because MNLF is another group. Now I think they are okay with it already, but before, for a long time, they said no. And there are also various traditional politicians in Sulu, in Basilan, in Tawi-Tawi, the local governors said, no, we do not want to be part of this decision because we have our own opinion. So always, there will always be, spoilers, or there will always be actors that will reject any kind of decision that has been made or that can be made. But at the same time, when we are beginning a dialogue process, we have to be careful on the selection of the participants of, the two parties, and to think ahead, what kind of problems, that we might have. Yeah, very good comment. Back channel happens all the time, and it exists, everywhere. Because even before we do the formal process between parties A and B, we need to do our preparation. The panels, the parties need to do their preparation, and they will rely on information, that they have gathered, including those that have been done, in secrecy. So these back channels are always very important. Sometimes we use this to test out the ideas. Somebody from party A or party B, for example, not necessarily contacting directly party A, but through intermediaries, those people that have connections, because we also have here advisory board, not necessarily a board, as such, but just to show that there are people that can advise the parties on how to move forward, what are the things that they need to do. And sometimes, it is necessary for them to test out these solutions or these recommendations with people on the other side, and they do this through back channel. So back channel, is happening all the time. So that's why I say you have the formal meetings and you have the informal meetings. And sometimes the informal ones are more important than the formal ones because they set up, the premise, for the formal talks. And in terms of getting out ideas, that's why consultation is always important. Consultation means that not only they consult each other, but they have to consult, they have to consult the communities to see whether what they are proposing is something that the community, would also agree with, would also agree with. And this is also important because the people in the community, they feel that they are victims of the situation. They are stakeholders, part of the stakeholders. And decisions are being made on their behalf without them being part of the process. And they actually, can have a strong, influence on any kind of decision, that can be made. So for example, the MILF process. The MILF process in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, we were supposed to sign the agreement on ancestral domain. Okay, ancestral domain, and then the decision was agreed between the two sides, in a formal meeting, that these are the issues in terms of ancestral domain. Ancestral domain includes territory, territories that used to belong to the Bangsa Moro people, and then they have lost it over the years to what they call, the Christian settlers, and to the government side, giving land, to the transmigrant and all those people. So it involves territory, it involves also power, control over territories, and so on. So the two parties decided on these things. But feeling happy, they did not want and then to sign it immediately. They want to have a formal session where they both can sign the agreement on ancestral domain, MOA AD. So they prepared time and location. I think it was August 5th, 2008. But before that actual signing of MOA AD on August 8th, some groups in Mindanao, some of the traditional leaders who feel not happy that their territories are being included in the areas of ancestral domain without consulting them, then went to the Supreme Court in the Philippines and asked the Supreme Court to cancel out or to put a restraining order on the MOA AD. And that's what the government or the Supreme Court did. They all went to Putrajaya in Malaysia to sign the agreement on August 4th. And the decision itself came on August 4th. And so there was no signing on August 5th because the Supreme Court came out with a decision that to put a restraining order, on the signing of MOA AD, and eventually said that the whole process was not only unlawful but unconstitutional because the interest of the community was not being addressed. So you have that issue that brought down the peace process. So consultancy is important. So as even if we want to negotiate, in secrecy, there must always be there must be checks, with the community because they are always affected by the decision. And we know that, maybe transparency is difficult while we are doing negotiation, but constant and frequent consultancy with the community is important because they, can spoil the decision. Back channel basically means any kind of activities that that are being carried out outside of the formal process, outside of the formal process. So for example, if groups like Bakubay group, Pak Isan, when he goes around talking to people on both sides and all those things, that is actually part of the back channel. Back channel. But a back channel platform can support the formal process by giving the information and laying down the foundation. It's an ongoing process because there must be complementarity between the actors. Because if we look at this model also, we know that every actors have their own roles to play. We have track 1, 1.5, 2, 3. So we need to look at what what the different actors can do in support of the peace process. So if the peace process, track one will have things that they need to do: trust building, confidence building, and then looking at all the issues, including territory and legal issues and all those things. But you have tracks 2 and 3 doing all these things. We are looking at peace building and conflict transformation activities being conducted by the different actors in tracks 2 and 3, playing roles according to their own capacity. Okay, so in order to do that, first of all, maybe we need to empower them. So we look at how empowerment of civil society can be done, and then we provide support for the process, participation of women and all those things, and some activities, that can be done by the various civil society groups to help the peace process. Okay, including even like monitoring of peace, for example. Monitoring of the peace process is something that is also important, because people want to make sure that the peace process goes on track, at that formal level and on the ground. In the Philippines, in the Mindanao process, if you can look this up in the book, in the source book, there is a section on Bantay ceasefire. Bantay ceasefire means ceasefire watch. And Bantay ceasefire, is something that has been done for many years by the Mindanao People's Caucus. Mindanao People's Caucus is a network of civil society organizations in Mindanao with the interest of monitoring the peace process and monitoring situation on the ground to make sure that whatever is happening up there is also happening down here. And then if we have a ceasefire agreement, the ceasefire agreement actually holds and has not and cannot happen to disrupt the process on the top, because there have been cases of ceasefire violations on the ground. Ceasefire violations on the ground. So the Mindanao People's Caucus actually do the monitoring on the ground. So that's why it calls ceasefire watch or Bantay ceasefire. And especially in the period before a formal peacekeeping or peace monitoring mission is there on the ground. So we are talking about the periods between 2003, 2004, early 2002, 2003, where we go around, and I was lucky. I was one of the member of the first ceasefire watch, back in the day, early 2000, doing investigation on violation of ceasefire, and we compiled a report that we submitted to the government of the Philippines, and then to the MILF, and then to the Malaysian facilitator, saying that, look, there are a lot of violations on the ground, which can happen, which has happened, and which can threaten, the peace process. So from that report, the two sides agree, the Malaysian sides agree, and we sent the Malaysian, then introduced the international monitoring team. International monitoring team comprised of monitors from Malaysia, from Brunei, from Libya at that time, and then to include later on Japan and the European Union. But then that started in 2004. Before 2004, there was no international monitoring team or IMT. But because of the work of the civil society organization, and in this example is the Mindanao People's Caucus with the Bantay ceasefire activity, then recommended that this is something that needs to be done. Then you get the international monitoring team. So you see how the connection, between on the ground and the formal process and the role of the civil society and all those things. So all these things, all these things are actually connected. Okay, so peace journalism, international donor supports, negotiation training. We also did a lot of trainings before in Mindanao, where we brought together, the Philippine, military, Philippine police, together with the MILF and also the Malaysian, also the international monitoring team. Peace monitors come down together and then doing mapping and analysis and all those things as part of activities, programs to support the process. As a conclusion, this peace process flow chart, this is a good attempt at trying to combine, all the different actors and the different aspects, components of a peace process from the various tracks, different types of activities. And we are not even, talking yet about the activities after agreement has been signed, issues of legitimacy, sustainability. Legitimacy, will also be impacted by the representativeness issue, transitional justice, and humanitarian issues. So look at this flow chart and see how a particular peace process is actually surrounded by all sort of activities, done by many different actors in order not only to push for this, the process, but to support the process. So everybody has a role to play. Everybody has a role to play, depending on who you are. And then both are okay, because without rapport, you will not get trust, so that is normal, the normal sequence also. For people to trust you, there must be rapport between you and them. So I would say, yeah, you can use both. We also hear terms like, confidence building, and trust is part of the necessary ingredient of confidence building, between the two sides. And then there are also terms like confidence building measures. And confidence building measures will be an item or an activity that is agreed upon by the two sides in order, to enhance that trust between the two sides. Because you cannot move forward if you do not trust the other side. So there must be trust, and then trust can be implemented, can be reflected in confidence building measures, confidence building measures. And confidence building measures will be something that, something that both sides, agree to, that would be important, to them, but it will not really resolve the conflict yet. It will not resolve the conflict yet, but it establishes a kind of, outcome that both sides actually come up together and agree upon, and they can use that as a stepping stone towards more difficult issues, towards more difficult issues. So for example, when they talk about, limited ceasefire, limited ceasefire during a certain time period, a certain time period. In southern Thailand, we've had a few of these. For example, we've had the Ramadan ceasefire, for example. We have had twice Ramadan ceasefire already. Does it resolve the conflict? No, it does not resolve the conflict. But at the same time, it created an understanding that both sides agree, to implement Ramadan to a limited amount of ceasefire during a particular period. And then if they can ensure, that the people on the ground, the combatants on the ground and the military and security forces on the ground to respect that ceasefire, it shows that they are also in control, of the people that are fighting on the ground. So it shows, it shows that, it shows that. So that in itself is a confidence building measure, and that can increase the trust between the two sides that, look, they said they will do this, they are doing this, and they have the capacity to influence people on the ground. So we can have confidence on them. Okay, so that's part of the creation of trust and confidence building measures. And a limited ceasefire can then move on, to a bigger agenda. The creation of peace zones, for example. You have an area where, we will say that, okay, no, military activities or insurgent activities within this particular area, because both sides respect, that this area is a peace zone. You are well aware where the flow chart is page 245 in our source book, and then it'll be useful for you, to look at the flow chart, and to look at how everything is more or less connected, and the kind of things that we need to do in order to be comprehensive in our approach. Basically, we're looking at peace process, and peace process, I'll just read this, persistent peace initiatives that develop beyond initial statement of intent and involve the main antagonist in a protracted conflict, involve an extensive set of variables, can be informal or formal, public or private, subject to popular endorsement or restricted to elite agreement, can be sponsored by external sources or spring from internal sources, but all are fragile and most fail sooner rather than later. So we have to make sure that any peace process that we are doing will not fail. So we need to make sure, what are the challenges that we have to overcome. So implementation of accord dependent on political will of the parties and on international and economic context. What are the kind of things, what are the kinds of questions that you need to ask, especially in the self-determination type conflict. This might be useful for people, working on this type of conflict. So maybe can be useful for Papua, for example, how because Papua, can be seen also as a self-determination type conflict. So these are some of the things, and especially in conflict areas that we are always focusing on, Mindanao, Aceh, and southern Thailand. These are also the questions. Also, I would think that these are also questions that can be asked in Myanmar as well. So the mediation process. Mediation is a process whereby a third party assists two or more parties with their consent. This is important, with their consent, to prevent, manage, or resolve a conflict by helping them to develop mutually acceptable agreements. The premise of mediation is that in the right environment, conflict parties can improve their relationship and move towards cooperation. Mediation outcomes can be limited in scope, dealing with specific issue in order to contain or manage a conflict, or can tackle a broad range of issues in a comprehensive peace agreement. Okay, so that's basically what it's all about. It's a process. It's a process, an ongoing process, with the consent of the parties. It's flexible but structured, flexible but structured, meaning that there is a certain form to it. Even if we say that, there need to be some kind of flexibility, usually it is always also partly structured. So we need to be able to know how to structure it carefully. Response to the specificity of the conflict, meaning that it is depending upon the context of the situation. Because even if each conflict situation, can be we can say they have generic contents, but each one will also have the different and specific context to that particular conflict. So it's a specialized activity. It provides a buffer for conflict parties, instill confidence in the process. And this is from the United Nations. The steps that we do in a conflict peace mediation process, and what's a mediator supposed to do. Just to know that there are different steps. This is what we meant by the structure. The structure. Usually start with informal context, and then talks is the pre-negotiation phase, and then the agreement phase, what we need to discuss, all those things, and then implementation, meaning that when we have finished at the end, we have an agreement. How do we implement the processes? And then we have the USIP peace mediation framework. I like this framework because it is simple. It breaks down the process into a few simple steps, and then it guides us on how to go about doing it, and then the details we need to put ourselves. Okay, so we always start with assessing the conflict, doing conflict mapping and analysis. We look at the mediator, whether the mediator is ready or not. So that's why we ensure mediator readiness. You will be surprised to see that in many situations, mediators are not really ready, to be a mediator. and that they are given the mediator's role because of their position, when they're not necessarily they have the expertise and the capacity, to do a proper mediation job. So we have to ensure mediator readiness. We look at the conflict, ensure conflict ripeness, whether a conflict is actually ripe for resolution or not. We talked a bit already about mutually hurting stalemate, as a situation that can show us, that maybe it is time, to resolve the conflict through a peace mediation process. This is a bit controversial. It is a bit controversial because when we talk about hurting stalemate, it has to do also with the level of violence that are involved and the level of suffering, of the people. And then, the Zaman talk about, mutually hurting stalemate as something, that can come about naturally. But the question is that, if the situation is not really ripe yet, what do we do? Do we enhance the ripeness? And do we enhance and how do we enhance the ripeness of a conflict situation? So this is a bit controversial, because some people has interpret this as that, if the situation is not hurting yet, we have to wait until it hurts, and then including maybe even to provide weapons, for example, to the smaller group to defend itself and to fight against the stronger group, so that there will come a situation where both groups will be at the same level, because a symmetric situation is always more conducive to peace. But if it is a situation that is asymmetrical, we have a stronger and a weaker party. Do we enhance the capacity of the weaker party to an extent that they are actually, symmetrical to the other side? So this is a moral dilemma that many of us would have, to face as well. Knowing well that, if we have a symmetrical relationship or a level that is the same, then both sides can take each other seriously. Both sides can take each other seriously. One example I can give is that, we see the level of intensity in the southern Thailand conflict has increased, especially since 2004. The conflict has been going on for many years, for centuries, even if you want to look way back to the collapse of the Sultanate of Patani in 1786, and then the creation of the liberation movements in the 50s and the 60s, but then it has been morally dormant in the 80s, but in the 90s. But in 2004, somehow we see an intensity, the intensity increase, starting from 2004 up to now, and many thousands of lives on both sides, have been lost in this particular conflict situation. And then we were wondering why this happened, until in 2013, we finally have a peace process. So if we look at the situation, can we actually analyze by saying that the peace process that happened in 2013 is because of the intensification of the conflict since 2004, since 2004. There is some truth to that, actually. There is some truth to that, because finally, the situation is such that the Thai government feel that they need to find a solution to reduce the violence. And by doing so, they need to talk, to the liberation movements in a way that is both formal and more inclusive. Okay, so that some analysts have said that intensification of conflict since 2004 has helped to enhance the ripeness. But again, big question mark, and it's a bit difficult to conclude. So then we have conduct track one mediation, we have the process, you have, all these things, what we need to do, consultation and pre-negotiation. We encourage track two dialogue, construct a peace agreement, what kind of agreement that we want to have, and then we plan for implementation. So that's the USIP mediation framework. And then there is also other guides, and then we have another guide, which is the UN guidance for effective mediation. And this is done by the Mediation Support Network. There is this mediation, MSN, Mediation Support Network, which is affiliated to the United Nations. And many of us working in the field of peace mediation are actually involved in this one. So I was also involved in doing, this guidance for effective mediation way back in 2011. And then we came out with a publication, that look at what are the guidance that we need to have. So just quickly, preparedness, all these things. Then we have consent. Both parties have to give their consent. And then we have impartiality, treating all actors fairly. Okay. Then inclusivity, national ownership. We must be aware of international laws and normative standards, and as much as possible, try to include this, try to include this in our mediation. Then we have the coherence, coordination, complementarity, because there are a multiplicity of actors, quality peace agreement, and then explanations of why some peace processes and peace accords fail. Many fail because of a combination of reasons. Combination, not necessarily just one reason, but a combination of reasons. For example, flaw in the process itself, not including all the key actors, and then actors not included can become spoilers in the process. Failures of leaders to carry their followers, to make sure that the followers agree to what have been signed and to follow up on these things. Failure to implement the disagreement, violence that happened after a peace accord have been signed, failure to deliver the economy, the spoils, of the peace process. People still unhappy that even when the peace process has finished, that the economic benefit is not there yet, and then other emergence of unanticipated developments. So we have this, and then again, some reasons why these things tend to fail as well. More or less the same. This is from Zedem and McGinty from their book Comparing Peace Processes. And lastly, basic premises for peace, lessons on peace process from Aceh and Mindanao. From our own experience, sometimes these are not in the textbook, but then this is more from the experience. Sincerity is important, because even if a party is involved in a peace process, it does not show. The process will not be able to be successful and even move forward if there is no sincerity, in beginning the peace process or in being part of the peace process. Sometimes people are doing this thing because they feel that they have to, or because they have been pressured to do so. But in reality, they are not really sincere. There have been cases where negotiators have been arrested when they go out, to be part of a peace process, and this actually do not show sincerity on the part of the parties. And then possibility of starting peace process. We already talked about the inclusivity aspect. Okay, absence of violence is not a prerequisite, meaning that a peace process can start even if violence is still ongoing, simply because we need to move it anyway. And then violence can be addressed along the way. Peace process is organic and cumulative. Organic meaning that it is from the soil of the conflict. It is those people who are there in the conflict areas, who are there as part of the conflict actors, on the ground there, that need to resolve this conflict, and not somebody from outside. We can have mediator, facilitator, third party from outside, but the success of the process depends on those within, the areas themselves. Cumulative means that, it is a step-by-step kind of process. We of course, we like to move forward, and it's cumulative. We start with ceasefire, maybe a limited one, then a full ceasefire, and then we go on to discuss a more substantive issues, political issues, all those other issues that are important. Then require trades off because they are deals. Primary function of the leader is to deliver their people, yes. Initiatives are needed to reintegrate members of the security forces and paramilitary groups into normal society. So when we talk about the post conflict reconstruction and rehabilitation, we also need to talk about how to reintegrate former combatants back to become useful members of society. In Aceh, this was done to the BRA, Badan Reintegrasi Aceh, the Aceh Reintegration Body. Although there have been challenges, reintegration is important. Otherwise, we will have sections of society who only knows how to fight, and then who does not know how to contribute in other ways back to society. Peace process does not end with a peace accord. Peace is also a development issue. We need to make sure development is there. Peace and justice are not always compatible in the peace process. We might need to wait until we finish the peace process to talk about the transitional justice and all those things, because sometimes if you do this too early, it will create obstacles also to the discussion. Absence of war is not peace. We know that. Indigenous approaches sometimes is more appropriate than international best practice. International best practice is always because we are always looking at other examples. We are always looking at how people have resolved conflict in Africa, in other parts of the world, even within the region. But somehow we neglect to see that maybe the solution is there. The solution for the Maluku people is actually there. In the Maluku area with the Muslim and the Christians there. And their indigenous approach is actually best to resolve their own conflict. Then political elites must find ways to broaden the appeal of the peace process and so on. In peace education, when we teach our students, we need to also give them like a comprehensive guide as to how a conflict can be resolved, and looking at peace process and peace mediation process and the interconnectivity between the various actors involved in such a process is something that is useful for them. Not necessarily to make them as negotiators, as mediators, but although there might be some, who will go on and do these things in their future career. We don't know, but this is to give them an idea how the process is done. This is also to give us an idea in the conflicts that we are facing, what are the ingredients that need to be there that might not be there now. For example, in Myanmar, Myanmar is a difficult case. There is many issues that are there. Many of the things that we have discussed here, these are ideal, approach, and they are not there in a messy, complicated situation like Myanmar. But then it gives us an idea on which angle that we can look and how we can improve on certain things. Mediation is a very competitive actually world, because we have many groups, including countries and international organizations that want to have the prestige of being a mediator in a peace process. So you're right, it's very competitive. Not necessarily that they know how to go about doing it, or they say that they know how to go about doing it, but because of other interests as well, sometimes financial, reputations, and all those things. In the situation in Aceh, we have had to international organizations that have become facilitator / mediator in the Aceh peace process. The first one, the Henry Dunant Center, then it became the Humanitarian Dialogue Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and that center was actually invited by the late, almarhum Gus Dur Abdul Rahman Wahid, Abdul Rahman Wahid, to facilitate, the conflict between Jakarta and the GAM. And the reason simply because, he was approached, that's the story, that's the story I got, from, my friends, that he actually was approached by the HD people, when he was one of his trip overseas in New York, and they approached him and saying that they have the capacity to do that. And he said, why not? This is an organization that's based in Geneva, Switzerland, a very peaceful country with a lot of a long reputation for being involved in conflict situation. The country, Switzerland, yes. HDC, no, because HDC was not a very old or very experienced organization. So HDC come in with the mandate of being a facilitator. And as a facilitator, there was a lot of oppositions for the CHD, and it's always going to be difficult for the CHD or the HDC, simply because it is an international organization trying to facilitate a conflict between an insurgent movement and a country and a government. And it's not even a government, it's an international organization with no strength and with strong background, in peace mediation. And that was partly the reason why it fails, because there were also a lot of oppositions within Indonesia, with HDC becoming the facilitator. The CMI, Crisis Management Initiative, is a bit different. It's a bit different simply because at that time, we have Vice President Yusuf Kala. Yusuf Kala was involved in Maluku, the Malino process. Yusuf Kala is a businessman. Yusuf Kala has many contacts, including businessmen from Finland by the name of Juha Christensen. And maybe the name sounds familiar. Juha Christensen has contact, with the Finnish government, and then proposed to Yusuf Kala that, look, why don't Yusuf Kala then take the initiative, to do some back channel informal talks, and he can arrange that, in the Scandinavian country, especially because the leaders, many of the leaders of the Free Aceh Movement GAM are in exile in Sweden, and Sweden is next to Finland, and it's easy, to do meetings in Finland and in Sweden. So that kind of connection then moved, to the involvement of the CMI, Crisis Management Initiative, to be the next third party for Aceh, and especially with strong backing from Yusuf Kala, the vice president. Sometimes you need that strong backing. Sometimes you need, support from the higher level, and CMI then, got involved. And the similarities between the HDC and the CMI process is that, the facilitator, third party, it's always an organization that has been invited in by, at least one of the parties, and then with the agreement of both parties in the end. So consent is always important. So that's why we look at all the other conflict situations, it's always the same thing. Malaysia has been invited by the Philippine government during the time of the GMA, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, to revive the peace process, that collapsed, in the aftermath of the all-out war, during the time of Estrada. So when GMA was replaced Estrada, she revived the peace process and then invited Malaysia to come in as facilitator. The same thing in southern Thailand. The government of Thailand agreed to Malaysia to act as the facilitator, because many of the leaders of the independence movement of southern Thailand are actually living in Malaysia, and Malaysia has control, basically has control over them, because Malaysia has allowed them to stay and basically control these leaders within Malaysia, so has access and can control the leaders. So that's to answer the first question of who selects and appoint these mediators or facilitators. Usually the conflict parties themselves, and they have to be there with the consent of both sides. So for example, if one party want one actor to come in, but then the other party does not agree to that, then it will not happen as well. The insurgent movement in southern Thailand actually want the OIC to be the mediator, but the Thai government insists on Malaysia, because there is that relationship, the Malaysia-Thai relationship, that they feel will be advantageous to them. For whatever reason, it's okay. It is what they want, and it is the consent of both parties. And if even one party said no, then that person or that group, will not be able to be part of that process. Malaysia has been invited, to be the facilitator of the Bangsa Moro conflict, because there are a lot of Bangsa Moro refugees residing in Malaysia, especially in the state of Sabah. In the state of Sabah, on Borneo Island, and Sabah, Malaysians say is the part of Malaysia. I think some of our Filipino friends here can argue, no, that's part of the Philippines, but that is another story. But Malaysia, is also affected by the Bangsa Moro conflict, because especially during the time of the Marcos period, the first Marcos, not this one, the martial law Marcos period in the 1970s, a lot of refugees have come over from southern Philippines to Malaysia, residing in the state of Sabah, many thousands, for a lot of years as well. So the connection is always there. Malaysia has always been interested in trying to resolve the Bangsa Moro conflict, to stop the influx of refugees from southern Philippines. So Malaysia is always ready. When the Philippine government asked Malaysia to be the facilitator, Malaysia also immediately agreed. There is also that issue of the Sabah claim, that has also question Malaysia's role in the process, because there are some in the Philippines that say that Malaysia has an interest because of the Sabah claim issue. But whatever it is, I think Malaysia has always been interested, to be part of the solution in the southern Philippines. There are two processes in southern Philippines. One, was the Moro National Liberation Front peace process. This was actually facilitated by the OIC starting back in the 1970s, during the time of the Gaddafi time, first with the Tripoli Agreement in 1976, and then continued on until they come to a final peace agreement in 1996. But that one was facilitated by Indonesia, representing the OIC. So Indonesia, in fact, was involved in the Bangsa Moro conflict in the Moro National Liberation Front track. Then the other track is with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and then that is Malaysia. But in both of these tracks, both of the third parties, Indonesia, OIC, and Malaysia, actually have been brought in by the Philippine government. With the consent of the Philippine government, and also the Bangsa Moro, organizations, both the MNLF and also the MILF. In regards to impartiality and neutrality, in any case, the mediator or the third party facilitator or mediator has to ensure impartiality, meaning that to treat impartiality basically means treating the two sides the same. Treating the two sides the same, even if they are government or even if they are, the organizations, whatever it is, both sides have to be treated the same. So that is what is meant by impartiality. Even if sometimes we feel that maybe the side is strong, has stronger relations with one side, impartiality is very important. Impartiality is very important. Treating the two sides the same. The question of the CMI, working on the scope of the mediation. Every negotiation must have a scope, and the scope for this kind of process would involve actually, what would the parties agree to give and not to give. And all governments, all states do not want to see their country disintegrating or being separated. So that is always a starting point for the state side of the of the parties. So NKRI, Negara Kesatuan Republik Indonesia, was put forward as the basic element that must be there in the peace process. If we are going to discuss independence, Indonesia does not want to be part of the process because that will result in the breakup of the Indonesian nation. So that has to be the basic thing, NKRI. The same thing, actually, if you look at the processes, the other peace processes, both in the Philippines and in the southern Thailand, that is also the basic element in the scope. In the Philippine process, in the Bangsamoro process, there is no mention of independence of the Bangsamoro. Okay, no mention of the independence of Bangsamoro because that would have go against, what the Philippine government holds dear, which is not the disintegration of the country. Usually, the other parties, would come up with a compromise solution. Okay, if we cannot get independence, what can we get? What can we get? And then it's up to the process and up to the facilitator and mediator to suggest different levels of solution. Okay, so in terms of the sovereignty of a nation, you have independence, and then you have autonomy, you have special autonomy, and then different gradients of autonomy. Different gradients of autonomy. The Acehnese did not want autonomy. The Acehnese said that, look, special autonomy, we have had special autonomy since the 1950s in terms of religion and all those things. It's nothing. It's the same. The solution that they found for Aceh was, because this was done in Finland. There is a small island between Finland and Sweden by the name of Åland Island, which has self-government. It doesn't belong to either Sweden or it doesn't belong to Finland. But it's not an independent nation. It's part of Sweden, but it has, what is called self-government. And that was the formula, that was proposed to the Acehnese, self-government. Okay, self-government, meaning that there are certain aspects of governance that is controlled by the Acehnese people. So when the MOU Helsinki was signed in 2005, that aspect was put, an aspect of self-government, self-government. And it made both sides happy. For the Indonesians, NKRI is still okay. You still have Negara Kesatuan Republik Indonesia. For the Acehnese, you have self-government. And the MOU even said that any decisions in regards to Aceh would have to be agreed to by the Acehnese. So it's stronger than the previous special autonomy, and that allowed the GAM to accept that MOU. And you have to remember, for the Free Aceh movement, this was also difficult, especially because they are Gerakan Aceh Merdeka, Free Aceh movement. Merdeka is independence. And then the leaders now are put in a position, by their people saying that you are traitors, you have betrayed our independence. Agenda for all these years we have been fighting for independence, and now we are back in NKRE. What's happening here? So they have to show their people that the solution is something that will also benefit the Achenese people, and that formula of self-government, is something, is the one that they push, self-government. So in any kind of negotiation, we have to play around with these words. If you ask me, is there any difference between the previous self-autonomy and the self-government? I would say yes, but not actually very much difference, But then in terms of convincing the people, this is important. So we need to be creative in finding, in finding the formula. The same thing in the Philippines. They did not get the independence, that they want. And we have to remember, these are liberation movement, Moro Islamic Liberation, Moro National Liberation, MNLF, MILF. So liberation is there. Liberation is independence. The same thing like the Achenese. But then the kind of formula that they push for is to give this self-government to them the way that self-government was given to the Achenese. So for example, now, after the signing of the CAB, we have the what do you call it, the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, and then the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which is an expansion of the previous ARMM, now BARMM, and then eventually they're going to come up with a Bangsamoro Parliament with a different system, which is based on ministerial system. And to them, this is good enough, for them to have self-government. So that's why in any negotiation, we need to find out what is the most important thing for the parties and to come closest to what they want without making them lose face with their supporters or making them lose power. So we need to go through, this information, this discussion. A lot of these things are also discussed in the book. You can read them up. Malaysia is not involved in the MNLF peace process. Okay, so that one is the OIC, and Indonesia is the one facilitating the MNLF process. For those that they are not familiar with the Philippine or the Bangsamoro peace processes, there are two big groups that are fighting for independence for the Bangsamoro. One is the Moro National Liberation Front, which for many years was led by Professor Nur Miswari, and the other one is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, used to be led by Chair Salamat Hashim, and now Chair Murad. The MNLF peace process was facilitated by the OIC through Indonesia. At the end, which came out with the final peace agreement in 1996. So Malaysia was not involved in that. Malaysia was only involved in the MILF process. Okay, MILF process. So if the question is what happened during the MILF process, Malaysia was not involved. Malaysia supports the OIC as a member of the OIC. And then it's also interesting to note that the role of OIC. Role of OIC in the Bangsamoro process actually has been very influential, because that was how the whole process started, back in the 70s, with the Libya involved and the OIC also, and especially in the 1990s, because the OIC also has, the MNLF as a representative of the Bangsamoro in the OIC, okay, which is a bit tricky, because it gave that status to the MNLF, but not to the MILF. So but MILF, they have some connection also, but OIC tend to move forward with the MNLF, not with the MILF, but they fully support also the process, the MILF process being facilitated by Malaysia. And in fact, that is one of the issues actually, because the local community, especially the Malay Muslim community, feel that their language is being lost over the years, and the teaching of the language is not being done, and so that's part of the problem. If you read chapter 5, on ending conflict, there is also a part there on the need for transformation in a peace process. And transformation would include not only the transformation of the context or the issues, but also of the actors and the personnel and the group involved in the process. So sometimes when you have that transformation, either the leaders change or the mindsets or the perception of the leaders change, then it can move things forward, as it had happened in Aceh. Aceh would not have happened if the leaders have not changed. From Suharto to B.J. Habibie to Gus Dur, for example, Megawati, and then SB. So if the leaders have not changed, as well as the perception and the attitudes of the leaders on both sides, because we are not only talking about the government side, but also on the movement side, because they need to also transform the way they see things, transform the way they see things. And I remember many years ago, I was talking to Pak Malik Mahmud. Malik Mahmud used to be the leader, the prime minister of GAM, and then eventually he became the Wali Nangro. And I asked him about the transformation of GAM, and basically especially because GAM was for independence, and he said that, look, during the time of the tsunami, we see how the people have suffered and how, they have been killed, and a lot of sufferings of the people. And we are for the people. If we, continue our struggle and not try to find another solution as soon as possible, they will just continue, the suffering of the people. So we need to be working with the Indonesian government in finding solutions that can help the people. So he would frame the transformation of GAM, in the way that they look at the situation and the need for them to change their approach. Okay, so that transformation then brought them, to the process. What can be done with the facilitator? In this case, Malaysia. In the Southern Thailand peace process, Malaysia as a country is the facilitating country. And then Malaysia appoints, a facilitator to facilitate the peace process. Maybe you do not know the inside story there, but the facilitator appointed by Malaysia actually come from the security sector. Before it was the former director general of the research department, which is the intelligence department of Malaysia. Then he was replaced by the former inspector general of police, who is the current facilitator at the moment. And if you ask me, I'll be very sincere, they might not be the best person to facilitate, the situation, because they come from a security standpoint. And security standpoint meaning that to them, a problem is resolved if there is no security issues. So they are more about lowering the intensity of the violence and securing peace. They neglect to see the other aspects that is needed in a peace process, and in a peace building process, which is, to also engage the communities, to engage the civil society and other organizations. They don't do that.